Lena Montgomery lived a life most could only dream of. Luxury, high-end parties, designer clothes, and a lifestyle that never seemed to disappoint. Every morning, her personal assistant made sure she had everything she could ever need. She never worried about money, never worried about being late, and never, ever had to do anything herself. Her world was one of ease, and that was just the way she liked it. She had little patience for people who didn't live up to her standards, especially those who were in the service industry. Waiters, cashiers, and anyone else whose job was to cater to her were nothing more than faceless figures whose purpose was simply to serve her. Lena never bothered to learn their names or care about their stories. To her, they were just people who existed to make her life easier, nothing more. Her attitude, though not always outwardly harsh, was clear in the way she treated them, expecting perfection but never offering anything in return. One evening, she walked into her favorite high-end restaurant, greeted by the sound of smooth jazz playing softly in the background and the sight of beautifully dressed patrons enjoying their evening. The dim lights, the polished silverware, the atmosphere, it was all exactly what she wanted. Everything had to be perfect, and it always was. As usual, Lena was dressed to the nines, her designer dress sparkling, her hair styled flawlessly, and her heels clicking confidently across the marble floor. She wasn't just another guest, she was the guest, the one everyone else should admire and envy. The waiter who greeted her was polite, his uniform crisp and immaculate, just like the restaurant. But Lena barely noticed him. He was simply a tool for her enjoyment, a fixture of the place she came to for luxury. As she was escorted to her table, she couldn't help but let her eyes linger over the other patrons, sizing them up in a way that only someone with Lena's mindset could. No one was quite as important as she was, and it was something she knew well. Her world was one of perfection and privilege, and the people around her were simply there to serve her, nothing more. Lena and her friends were seated at a prime table near the window, overlooking the city's skyline. The view was breathtaking, but Lena barely gave it a glance. She was far more interested in the menu, as though choosing the right dish would somehow elevate her evening even further. The waiter who approached their table was a young man, in his mid-20s, with an easy smile and a calm, composed demeanor. His name tag read Ethan. "Good evening, ladies." Ethan greeted them politely, his voice warm and inviting. "I'll be your server this evening. Can I start you off with some drinks?" Lena barely looked up from her menu, already certain of what she would order. "I'll have the usual. A glass of Chardonnay, please," she said, her tone dismissive as she waved her hand almost absently in his direction. Her friends ordered similarly, and Ethan jotted everything down quickly, never missing a beat. As he returned with their drinks, he poured the wine with precision, making sure to fill each glass just right. "Is there anything else I can get for you, or any questions about the menu?" he asked, his voice still polite and attentive. Lena smirked slightly. "Actually, yes," she said, looking at him with a raised brow. "Is the steak any good here? I'm sure it's decent, but I'm hoping for something extraordinary, something special for the price." Ethan smiled again, though the hint of discomfort was just barely visible. "It's one of our most popular dishes, ma'am. I think you'll enjoy it," he replied, trying to maintain his professional tone. Lena's eyes narrowed. "Well, if it's as good as you say, I suppose I'll give it a try. Let's just hope it lives up to the hype," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. The rest of the meal continued in much the same way. Ethan refilled their glasses, checked in occasionally to ensure everything was to their liking, and made sure the food arrived hot and fresh. He was courteous, smiling when appropriate, and never once did he show a hint of annoyance. But Lena, for all the politeness of his service, remained cold and distant. She offered no compliments, only curt requests, and the occasional remark about how someone should really teach him the finer points of wine pairing. As the meal drew to a close, Lena's thoughts were focused more on how much the evening was costing her than the excellent service she had received. Ethan had done his job flawlessly, but to her, it didn't matter. He was just a waiter, after all, someone who existed to serve her and her friends. There was no need to show appreciation. When the bill arrived, Lena took it without a second thought. After briefly scanning the total, she handed over her credit card, not leaving a single tip. Ethan stood by the table, patiently waiting for the transaction to process, but when Lena slid the bill back across the table, she made no gesture of gratitude. She didn't even make eye contact. "Thank you, ma'am," Ethan said with a polite smile, though his voice faltered ever so slightly. Lena just nodded, as though his words were an afterthought, and turned her attention back to her friends, already moving on to the next topic of conversation. As the last course was cleared away, Lena sat back in her chair, glancing around the table, satisfied with her evening. The restaurant was known for its luxurious atmosphere, and it had delivered just as expected. The food had been perfectly cooked, the wine paired beautifully, and Ethan had been attentive without being overly familiar. He had done his job well, but that didn't mean he deserved anything extra. Not in Lena's mind. When the check was brought to the table, she eyed the total with a slight frown. It was a hefty sum, but she didn't care. After all, this was what she had paid for, a luxury experience. The waiter's service was simply part of the deal. The thought of leaving a tip never even crossed her mind. Why should she reward someone for doing their job? To her, that was what they were paid for, and a tip was a bonus, not a requirement. Ethan, standing just a few feet away, was quiet, waiting for Lena to make the final gesture. He had been kind, respectful, and had provided excellent service, but Lena wasn't about to let herself be swayed by what she saw as unnecessary pleasantries. The tip was optional, and she wasn't about to waste money on something that didn't feel required. She handed over her credit card with the practiced air of someone used to getting what they wanted, not even sparing a glance at Ethan. He took the card and processed the payment, doing his best to maintain his composure. But there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight hesitation in his movements as he placed the receipt on the table for her to sign. Lena signed quickly, almost impatiently, and handed it back to him, still without looking at him directly. She knew Ethan had been expecting a tip, and the discomfort in his eyes was evident, but she simply didn't care. He had done his job, and that was enough. Her decision was final. No extra money was necessary. As Ethan walked away, the quiet awkwardness hung in the air. Lena didn't think twice about it. In fact, she felt a sense of satisfaction. She had the power to decide what was and wasn't worthy of her generosity, and she was proud of it. She wasn't one of those people who felt compelled to throw money around to appease others. Generosity was for those who couldn't afford to take charge of their own lives. And she was beyond that. A few days later, Lena found herself in an entirely different setting. The polished floors, the clean-cut lines, and the hushed whispers of the courthouse were a stark contrast to the elegant atmosphere of the restaurant. She had been summoned as a witness for a case that, on the surface, seemed trivial, a contract dispute between two business partners. It was an ordinary task, one she'd handled many times before, but today, something felt off. Her unease had started the moment she stepped inside the courtroom. As she sat in one of the hard wooden chairs near the back, waiting for the case to begin, her thoughts wandered. The walls were lined with solemn portraits of past judges, their stern gazes following everyone who passed by. The cold air in the room felt heavier than usual. Lena shifted in her seat, adjusting her designer handbag nervously. She glanced around the room, trying to distract herself from the looming anxiety. That's when her eyes landed on the judge's seat. The man sitting there was dressed in a black robe, his face partially obscured by the desk in front of him. But as he looked up, Lena froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Ethan, the same waiter she had dismissed so carelessly just a few days ago. The man who had served her without complaint, despite her condescending remarks. He was now seated in the judge's chair, his posture strong, his expression stern and commanding. The transformation was nothing short of startling. Gone was the polite, mild-mannered server. In his place sat a figure of authority, radiating confidence and power. Lena's heart began to race as a cold wave of realization washed over her. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was him, Ethan. The same man she had treated like a mere servant, the same man she had denied a tip as though he was beneath her. And now he was the one holding the gavel. He was the one in charge. She felt a strange mix of embarrassment and regret slowly creeping in. The room, once so familiar, suddenly felt foreign. Every word he spoke seemed to echo in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her actions had led to this moment, somehow. The image of him pouring her wine at the restaurant, his friendly smile masking his discomfort, played over and over in her mind. How could she have been so blind? How could she have treated him like that? As the trial began, Lena tried her best to keep her composure, but every glance at Ethan made her stomach turn. His eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the room as he called the case to order. His voice, calm and authoritative, filled the courtroom, and he directed the proceedings with ease. But there was something else in his demeanor, something she couldn't ignore. An underlying sense of quiet power, the kind that came with experience, strength, and dignity. Lena tried to focus on the case at hand, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. She couldn't help but wonder. Did he recognize her? Did he remember how she had treated him so poorly? She felt her pulse quicken, and a strange sense of dread settled in her chest. It was clear now. Ethan was no longer just the man who poured her wine. He was someone far more important, and she couldn't escape the sinking feeling that her past actions were about to come back to haunt her. As the trial unfolded, Lena's nerves continued to build. Her mind raced with the implications of having Ethan in such a position of authority, and with each passing minute, the weight of her earlier actions seemed to hang heavier on her shoulders. She tried to focus on the details of the case, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that Ethan, the waiter she had so casually dismissed, was now presiding over her fate. When the moment came for the judge to address the court directly, Lena braced herself. Ethan's voice rang out with the authority of someone who had earned respect, not demanded it. His words were measured, deliberate, each one delivered with an assurance that had been completely absent from his tone the last time she had encountered him. He wasn't the young, polite waiter anymore. He was a judge, a man of power. "I would like to address the court about the matter at hand," Ethan began, his gaze flicking to Lena. She felt a chill run down her spine as his eyes met hers, but she quickly turned her attention to the desk in front of her, pretending to focus on her notes. "This case involves unethical decisions made by one of the parties," he continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. "Decisions that affected many, and those decisions have consequences. The party in question," he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, "is Ms. Lena Montgomery." Lena's breath hitched. The room seemed to close in around her as his words hit her like a blow. The case, the one she had thought was insignificant, was about her. Her actions, her choices, and the consequences of the things she had done in the past. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her, steady and unwavering. He wasn't looking at her with anger, but with something far more unsettling, an unwavering clarity, as though he could see right through her. As he continued, Lena's thoughts began to spiral. Her mind raced through her past dealings, her business decisions, her attitude toward the people she considered beneath her. She had always assumed she could get away with it. After all, she was Lena Montgomery, untouchable, invincible, the one who controlled her destiny. But now, everything she had believed about her place in the world was being torn apart. "This isn't just about money," Ethan said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "It's about integrity. It's about the kind of person you are when no one is watching, when no one is holding you accountable." His words pierced through her like arrows, each one finding its mark. He wasn't just speaking about the case, he was speaking directly to her, holding up a mirror to the woman she had been. The judge's decision was swift and uncompromising. "Given the unethical choices that have been made," he declared, his voice firm, "and the impact they have had on others, I find Miss Montgomery liable for damages. There will be restitution, and further actions will be taken to address the harm caused by her decisions." The finality of his words rang out, and Lena's mind raced to process what had just happened. The world she had built for herself, the world where she was always in control, had crumbled in an instant. She had no power here, no way to escape the consequences of her actions. She had been caught in the web of her own making, and now there was no getting out. As the room erupted in murmurs, Lena's sense of superiority shattered. She couldn't ignore it anymore, the judgment, the truth. Ethan, the waiter she had brushed aside, had taken the reins of his life, and now he was the one holding her accountable. She was no longer the one in control. She was no longer the one who called the shots. Lena's heart sank as she realized that everything had come full circle. She wasn't above anyone, not anymore. The man she had treated like an insignificant part of her world had now become her judge, and in that moment, she was forced to face the consequences of every decision she had made. As Lena walked out of the courtroom, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The echoes of Ethan's voice, his decisive words, still lingered in her ears. She had always prided herself on being above it all, on standing at the top of her carefully constructed world. But now, as she stood in the cold hallway, a deep sense of humility washed over her. She had spent years looking down on people like Ethan, dismissing them as mere servants to her needs, assuming that her wealth and status made her untouchable. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very man she had snubbed had been the one to bring her to her knees, holding her accountable for her own actions. The reality of the situation slowly sank in. She had built her life on the belief that her success made her better than others. But now she was forced to confront the truth, that no one was truly above anyone else. Life had a way of humbling those who thought they were untouchable, and she was living proof of that. Lena's arrogance had once been her armor, but it had now become her downfall. Her treatment of others, her refusal to acknowledge the humanity in the people she considered beneath her, had led to this moment of reckoning. She thought she could remain insulated from the world, but the truth had caught up with her. Karma had a way of finding its mark, and in this case, it had come with a sharp, undeniable force. As she walked out into the bright sunlight, Lena felt a shift within herself. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could learn from it. She could choose to be different, kinder, more aware of the people around her. She had spent so much time climbing to the top, never realizing that the higher she went, the harder the fall would be. With a deep, steadying breath, Lena made a silent vow to herself. From now on, she would never look at people the same way again. No matter their station, no matter their role in her life, she would treat them with the respect they deserved. The lesson had been painful, but it had been necessary. In the end, Lena understood that true power didn't come from money or status. It came from the way one treated others, with kindness, humility, and empathy. And now, she had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Life had a way of humbling those who thought they were invincible, and Lena had finally learned to embrace her humanity. If you enjoyed this story and the powerful lesson it brought, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more thought-provoking tales like this one. Like if you believe in the importance of kindness and humility, and don't forget to comment below to share your thoughts or personal experiences. If you think someone could benefit from hearing this lesson, be sure to share it with them. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more inspiring stories.